Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you to this afternoon's performance and this opera talk. I'll say a few words about the opera, and then for those of you who would like to ask questions, the technology is a little limited, but you're going to have to come up. We can't, and or some, we'll figure it out. This summer, as you know, the Bard Music Festival every year chooses a composer, and next year we have chosen Nadia Boulanger, and which will also involve her sister Lily, and the opera will be the King Arthur by Ernest Chausson, which is a fantastic, great French opera, which connects to the young years of the Boulanger sisters. We try to choose an opera that is connected with the subject of the festival, and we chose Erich Wolfgang Korngold, in part because he bridges at least two worlds. One is the American world and the world of popular culture, in a way, through the film medium, perhaps the most important medium of the 20th century, and the moving image. And the moving image also, ironically, was the greatest competitor for concert attendance and opera attendance in 20th century history. So with the beginning of the silent film, audiences, much of instrumental music in the late 19th century profited from what I would call the visualized daydreaming experience of the audience. How did people get through an hour-long Bruckner or Mahler symphony? They didn't necessarily, there are levels of what it meant to get through it. Those who were sophisticated, there were those who were sophisticated amateur musicians who had studied some aspects of theory, could follow the compositional logic. That's possible. That was a minority. Let's not romanticize the past. But sitting through an instrumental essay of an hour's length, without really understanding the technical grammar of the language, was not entirely easy, which is what made Wagner so successful, and what made Liszt so influential, and in the 1890s, what made Richard Strauss so fantastically successful. He was able to tell a story, Don Quixote, Don Juan, a metaphysical story, Death and Transfiguration, Macbeth, through instruments, as Liszt was. And this narration, which Dvořák took up at the end of his career, as he set the Erben poems to music, this enabled the audience to sit through, and it was a remarkable opportunity in a public space, and the time changed. Music changes your perception of time, and go through the kind of fantastic journey in your mind, maybe with some visual images of your own making, which of your own private creation. And it was an extremely attractive form of entertainment. This film, the so-called silent film, which was really never silent because there was always musical accompaniment, gave that kind of experience, which we like, we now watch on our computers, that this was a kind of visual replacement. And when the very influential book, The Decline of the West, by Oswald Spengler, kind of proto-fascist story of the decline of the shifting sands of history, so to speak, one of the things that he pointed to as the decline of Western culture was the triumph of the visual. and that the visualization and that music had reached a peak with Tristan and Wagner, and that the decline of listening as opposed to seeing was a kind of symptom of an impending doom for culture. I bring this up because the vocabulary, musical vocabulary of late 19th century European composition, exemplified, I think, most by Richard Strauss, was an elaborate expansion of the vocabulary of classical music that we associate with Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven, and its expansion into a very effective form of narration and storytelling. And that's what made Strauss also a great opera composer. And the imagination which Strauss used in both the use of harmony and rhythm and sonority from the orchestra, and a kind of synthesis of the tradition of Brahms, of the classical tradition, and of Wagner. And so Korngold is credited with creating the Hollywood sound. What makes him an important figure in American culture is that he came to Hollywood. He used to say that Robin Hood saved his life. Not directly, of course, since there probably was no Robin Hood. And the same way they joked in the studio that when you watch the film, it's not Robin Hood in Sherwood Forest, but Robin Hood in the Vienna Woods. And there's a little bit of that, no doubt, in the Robin Hood score. But the fact is that as this opera that you're about to hear will tell you, he didn't invent the Hollywood sound. He took a vocabulary that he had developed and a sonority and a way of writing music that was unbelievably adaptable to the moving image. So from the opera stage to the screen was not that he went to Hollywood and had to do something entirely new. He wasn't quite used to what was involved, but more used to it than one thinks. So briefly about the composer himself. He was born in 1897. He was the younger sibling, one of the hidden dark sides of the Korngold family. There was an older brother who was also a musician, who was essentially abandoned and rejected by the parents, both mother and father, in the face of a child prodigy. So if any of you have more than one child and you think one child is more gifted than the other, beware of the consequences of favoritism. Hans Robert Korngold died a pauper in a welfare institution outside of Vienna. And that should never happen, and there's no doubt the blame goes to the parents. A worse set of parents one can not possibly imagine. Comparisons have been made between Julius Korngold and Leopold Mozart. That's an unfair insult to Leopold Mozart. Leopold Mozart was a wonderful musician, fine composer, and actually a very strict but very wise father. Without Leopold Mozart, there would be no Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. And Julius Korngold, in contrast, was not a composer, but a music critic. He had studied composition with Bruckner, but was trained as a lawyer. And he became kind of an acolyte of Edward Hanslick, and Hanslick chose him to succeed him in the major paper of Vienna. Over actually a very good operetta composer and choral conductor, Richard Heuberger, who wrote a very famous hit operetta called The Opera Ball. Julius Korngold became a terror. He was the kind of critic that I've had the misfortune of reading practically everything. And it's hard to describe. It's nasty, imperious. There's no argument, there's only declaration, and an unrelenting desire to pound the reader with his own authority. He was so terrifying that Alban Berg and his friends in the 1920s got together a magazine whose only purpose was to chase him down. He got into a libel suit with Willy Reich, the first biographer of Alban Berg. He was very feared. The reason Erich Kleiber didn't conduct the performance, I think, of Die Tote Stadt in Berlin is because Julius Korngold had given such a terrible review that so the task fell to the young George Zell. So Julius Korngold had this son. They came from Brno to Vienna, and he was a big shot, powerful man, and he has this son who showed unbelievable musical talent. I'll cut the story short only to say that in some bizarre way, a ballet pantomime called The Snowman, which we'll do some excerpts from, was produced at the Vienna Opera when the boy was 11 years old. And the music was circulated. There's a famous cartoon with all these gray beards looking over the shoulder of this young kid, and includes Strauss and Mahler and Zemlinsky and Pfister, everybody who was anybody. And this kid was amazing. As you'll discover in the festival, the music that he wrote as a child and an adolescent does not betray the fingerprints of childhood. Nothing Mozart wrote is of the same, what I would call, maturity. It's as if this child, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, was able to write and speak in music in the manner of an adult. That's what was the most amazing thing. The sophistication of the command of musical time. And when the father would send the music around, people were flabbergasted. And the father was advised to take care. Now, side story is there was another prodigy, exactly the same age, with the same talent, and that was George Zell, who made his debut at the age of also 11 with a piece of his own and playing a Mozart piano concerto. And George Zell wrote a hell of a lot of music when he was an adolescent. But George Zell made the decision that his music was derivative, not original. And he gave up composition and turned his attention piano playing and to conducting. In the case of Erich Wolfgang Korngold, the father became deeply invested in the career of his son. And it became an open, the libel suit was over the fact that Korngold would give a review only to people who supported his son's music. And he saw everybody else as a rival to his son. When Strauss and Schalk took over the Vienna Opera in the 1920s, he tortured them. And they produced as many Korngold operas as they could in order to stay on his right side, on the father's right side, which they never succeeded in doing. And both father and son were viewed with fear and terror. The son the composer seemed to have been a very, very nice man and never really grew up, I don't think. Very much protected, incredibly protected by the parents, that he managed to marry a wonderful woman from also a similar Jewish family. Most important ancestor was one of the great stage actors of Vienna, Otto von Sonnenthal. That was a miracle, a miracle, like the miracle of Heliane, and to whom actually the opera is dedicated, to his wife. And so Korngold's career was meteoric as a composer. The most famous milestone is Die Tote Stadt, which is the most famous of the operas, which was premiered to great success in 1920. But to get a perspective, the most popular opera composer in Central Europe, in Germany, in the 1920s, was Puccini. And after that, Strauss, but the first three Strausses. The conservatism of the opera-going, proper-producing public, proper-going public, opera-producing professional community is long-standing. There were a lot of new operas done. The 20s was an extremely vital period. Hindemith, with his one actors, Krenek, Franz Schreker, probably the most successful new opera composer in the German language, Walter Braunfels. It was an extremely active art form and very competitive. And with Die Tote Stadt, he was already world famous. When Strauss went on tour to the United States with the Wiener Philharmonic, he played Korngold, and Korngold was well known as a figure. The music wasn't that well known. Die Tote Stadt had one real hit, a Operetta song. I mean, there were some. He really did fantastically well. So after the success of Tote Stadt, he starts to think about a big tragic opera. And when this opera is premiered in 1927, there are two other operas that are almost exactly contemporaneous. One is notoriously important because it is the jazz opera by Ernst Krenek called Johnny spielt auf. And when it was premiered in Vienna, alongside not the premiere of Heliane, but the Viennese premiere of Heliane, there was such a competition that there were cigarette manufacturers that put out competing cigarettes. A Johnny cigarette and a Heliane cigarette. And there was a war, and of course Julius Korngold had nothing good to say about Johnny spielt auf, because jazz was greatly popular in Europe after World War I. Jazz was considered the beginning of the end of culture, the dumbing down of, it's the way people reacted initially to rap music and hip-hop and so forth and so on. There's this pattern of older generations seeing the new popular trend as the harbinger of the death of culture. When we were growing up, we came from Europe, it was the comic book. So, you know, there's always this, and so jazz was considered kind of the beginning of the end. And so opposed to that was this opera by his son, which was kind of a great example of the vitality of tradition. Julius Korngold and his son, for reasons I don't fully understand, but he became an acolyte of his own father. His father was domineering, and he bought his father's aesthetic point of view. That tonality, tradition, and beauty, what I would call decorative beauty, conventional notions of beauty, symmetry, transparency, are valid, normatively valid. They're not my opinion, they're just true. And that people who don't abide by them, and that meant dissonance, something like Wozzeck was, from Julius Korngold's point of view, a travesty, brilliant as he understood it to be. And melody was everything, and the model of melody was Schubert. The model of melody was Beethoven. He once said about Debussy that no note of Debussy can be compared to a single song of Schubert. So this was a kind of attitude toward musical language and logic. And the son bought into it. To a great degree, this opera has modernist aspects to it. There's a lot of tension between father and son. The letters show a lot of anger. The parents never accepted the wife. But Julius Korngold was a presence in the Hollywood studios, as Erich von Korngold wrote and recorded the soundtracks to all those films. He died in 1945. And the son brought him over from Europe after the Anschluss. In the 20s, father and son were looking for a serious opera story. And the other competing opera outside of Johnny spielt auf is Strauss's Egyptian Helen, written with Hugo von Hofmannsthal, and that is a retelling of a famous retelling of what happens to Helen of Troy and her husband after the fall of Troy. Oh, a fascinating subject. Where did they go? Did they go on a second honeymoon? Right? What did they say to each other? Do you like me better than Paris? No? What was to be said after the carnage of the Trojan War? Right? And so this is a libretto that Hofmannsthal and Strauss worked on. Originally, and this is important for Korngold as well, the 20s, which were an unusual and very changing decade and politically very unstable in Germany and in Austria, where there was a bloody civil war and a really chaotic period, there was a revival of interest in operetta and in light music. Actually, after this premiere, Korngold spent the next 10 years of his life essentially only working in the operetta form with some commissions for concert music. And he worked on an opera called Die Katrin, which is a light opera. And he redid Johann Strauss. He completed works by Leo Fahl from the Silver Age of operetta, and also Offenbach. And there was something about a desire for lightness in a very difficult time that occupied these composers to get away from the heaviness that was associated with the late 19th century and the period of Mahler, let's say. The other thing is that in Korngold's case, he and the father had an ambivalent attitude to Wagner, and they were very admiring of Puccini and of the melodiousness of Puccini and of the structure of most Puccini operas, which kind of went from musical event to musical event. They were not symphonically composed. They were actually the revival of the idea of the opera as a kind of entertainment of pieces that go, whether they're ensembles or solo pieces, and not the Wagnerian theory of a kind of continuous dramatic fabric in which the voice and the orchestra are integrated, and where there are real arias and this kind of and very an Italianate idea of melody, which Wagner didn't really cultivate. So they're looking for a serious sequel to Die Tote Stadt, and this poet who died, this Kaltnecker, whom Korngold has wonderful songs and set some of them. He also, later in life, I think the last piece he ever wrote was actually a setting of a Kaltnecker text. And they have this play which is lost, and it goes through various iterations. There is this fellow Müller, who is a playwright, a successful playwright. And many people tinker with this libretto. I think the main tinkerer may have been the father, who I have a suspicion wrote or edited most of it, but that's only a suspicion. And they chose a mystery play of some kind. Now, the story is symbolic. The way to think about it is, how many of you ever watched a Star Trek episode? Okay. Now they go to weird planets where there's sort of weird societies that look semi-ancient. Vulcan, they talk funny and they operate in symbolic ways. So the humans who go to them see a world which somehow, I think the people who wrote Star Trek thought they would moralize back to us, a future world in which everything was black or everything was white, or, so this is kind of an imaginary space. There's no historical moment here. We're not in the situation of having to do a production of an opera that's set in 1790. We don't have to take Fidelio and turn it into a Gestapo prison, and violating the libretto, which of course is not set during the Third Reich. You follow me? There's nothing to modernize because there's nothing there. It's generic. There's a ruler and a stranger. And the origins of this mystery play are not hard to trace. The stranger is a kind of Jesus figure. The whole idea that love will redeem us and bring us freedom is an old idea. I mean, it's basically Christian, so there is a huge Christian tradition of the redemption of love. There's the connection to Parsifal, about the purity of love, Amfortas' wound, and a weird dancing around the issue of sexuality. There is explicit nudity here. The lead is not nude. I don't approve of that, generally. I think nudity is actually the last gasp of desperate directors who want to keep the attention of the audience. So gratuitous nudity is I think, offensive. She wears a bodysuit, which is made to look like she has no clothes, but the libretto explicitly calls for it. You follow me? That no, we didn't invent this. So the sexuality part of it is complicated. A colleague of ours, Michael Haas, who produced the first recording of this, which I've not heard, with John Marcheri years ago, has a whole blog about the relation of this to Freud. It's an interesting argument. I don't actually share it, that it's something about sexual liberation. I'm not sure that's right, but it's anybody's guess. I don't have the answer. It's up to you to make the answer. The opera doesn't tell an explicit story. You have to figure out what you think the story means. The story in its basic outline is that you witness a state, a city-state, as in Greek drama, that is under oppression. This is not a new idea. Oedipus the King is based on this idea as well. And the stranger has obviously been there and given happiness, and the wife of the ruler, who's very beautiful, the heroine, Heliane, they fall in love, and the bearer of happiness and the wife. The wife, you find out during the course of the opera, although married to the ruler, the relationship has never been consummated, which is parallel to the dispute of the opera, which is whether in the cell Heliane, naked or not, actually consummated the sexuality with the stranger, which of course she denies. Through a process of then the jealous ruler, the tyrant, it ends up that Heliane goes on trial in part because the stranger kills himself, a kind of sacrifice, to protect Heliane, although Heliane really is presumably telling the truth. And then she's put on trial, and her condemnation is mitigated by the possibility that she can perform a miracle, which is to bring the dead stranger back to life. And in Act 3, she succeeds in doing so. Her success in doing so, which seems to indicate to the ruler that they were really lovers, makes the ruler insane and kills Heliane. But since the stranger is already Obi-Wan Kenobi, he's sort of in a second life, or in The Lord of the Rings, when Gandalf comes back, not Gandalf the Grey, but Gandalf the White. So the stranger is back in business. She then assumes the same ethereal reality, alive but not dead, and they both ascend to heaven. But the main point of this is that the city is freed from tyranny. So it is a kind of apocalyptic, almost evangelical parable about the power of love to liberate from tyranny. We chose this opera because we're doing a Korngold festival. We've not only always done operas by the composers we've focused on. But in this case, he saw himself as an opera composer. And more important than that, this piece has never been done in the United States, never been staged in the United States. It's been the object of a lot of speculation. Schott, what you're hearing is the first performance with the new performing materials that Schott just published. For some reason, the Schrakers, the Korngolds, were very attached to Schott, which was had a very complicated and not altogether attractive history in the Second World War as a publishing company, a non-Jewish publishing company. They were loyal to them, although the loyalty, I don't think, was reciprocated on the Schott part. So this was premiered in 1927. I do believe the political backdrop made a difference. The tyranny was only visible in part in Italy under Mussolini, but Austrian Jews were very much pro-Mussolini. Hard to imagine that. But the chaos that they experienced in the 1920s in Vienna and in Austria, and with the burgeonings of what later became Austro-fascism, made people even like Stefan Zweig sympathetic to the young Mussolini. The idea of order and stability and so. It's very prescient because obviously the idea of love triumphing over tyranny is a great wish. It just didn't work when the tyranny actually arrived. The opera was premiered in Hamburg and had a moderate success. It was then performed in Vienna and other places. It didn't go anywhere. It was actually, from the Korngold point of view, a flop. Why? It's hard to say. There is some aspect of anti-Semitism already in the late 1920s. There was some beginning. It got very intense in 1930 and 1931 before the Nazis took power. So, yes, Jewish composers were at a disadvantage, but that doesn't totally explain it. Koenig thought in the Viennese situation, Korngold thought in the Viennese situation, Koenig sort of had got sort of the PR advantage. Heliane was viewed as a little old-fashioned. And although this is the work which Korngold tries his best to look and sound modern, so you'll notice through the entire opera, most of the opera is, Korngold in general, is a composer that likes closed melodic forms that have cadences. This is technical mumbo jumbo, but it means basically that he doesn't operate with a lot of semicolons and commas. He likes periods. Right? So, but in order, and his harmonic language is a kind of ordinary melodic, or not sort of slitheringly chromatic. There is some of that. Tuneful, I would say, in a good and wonderful way. But he also wants to make it modern, so he adds notes. It's like taking a picture, and it's one color, and he adds other color. There are moments of polytonal, two tonalities overlapping. There are moments where she sings in one key, and the orchestral accompaniment is a distorted mirror image in a different key, and there's clashes. There are things. He actually experiments in an interesting way, not so much rhythmically, but harmonically, very adventuresome in this sense. So it's not old-fashioned. It's not like the music, let's say, of Max von Schilling's, which is more just the old-fashioned. The composer he admired most was Richard Strauss. And shortly before he died, there was going to be a broadcast of Elektra from Salzburg, and he looked forward to following it over the radio with the score. He could play most of it, not all of it, by heart. This was a phenomenal talent. In that sense, Julius Korngold had every reason to be overwhelmed. He was a fantastic pianist, composer, nothing he couldn't do. And So what's interesting is that a great participant in this drama is the orchestral sonority. Now, Strauss, I mentioned Strauss, Strauss's orchestration, Strauss's command of the orchestra was incredible. And for his entire life, although Zemlinsky was Korngold's main teacher and wrote fantastic operas in the 20s, the same time as this was being written, it's Strauss really that casts a shadow. And interesting, in 1927, the Egyptian Helen, which is about love and reconciliation, and it's the same subject done differently, premieres at the same time. The difference is that the sonority that he uses has some influence from Gustav Mahler, and that is the kind of decorative use of percussion, celeste, harp, Glock. There's a kind of shimmering quality to the way the orchestra is used that is extremely visual, a tremendous color. The guy has an unbelievable command of detailed color. And because it's in this opera, he narrates something, and there are distinct episodes in the opera. When he goes to Hollywood, his first assignment in Hollywood is putting a pastiche together of Mendelssohn's music for a Max Reinhardt production. He had worked a lot with Reinhardt in the theater in Berlin and Vienna, and Reinhardt greatly admired him. And the father was suspicious of Reinhardt, but be that as it may. And so when he was asked to do a sound film of the Shakespeare play with Mickey Rooney and Olivia de Havilland and so on, he brought Korngold. This is 34, 35. And Korngold returned to Vienna. And then Jack Warner, who was a real music lover, and I think Jack Warner liked the music more than he liked the stories or the actors. And this is the Hollywood system where always the same actors. They had a studio group. Claude Rains, one of my favorites, Paul Henry, Betty Davis, and of course Errol Flynn. So they want to make Robin Hood, and Warner sends a telegram to Vienna, and he comes over to write. First, he didn't want to do it. The whole story didn't motivate him. He was not. And finally, it was a great success, and he went on to make many, many movies. And I recommend these movies. One of the movies has the best acting ever done by Ronald Reagan. It's King's Row. And two of the movies, improbably, depict the predicament of a composer. And it's a completely different level than Mozart. Is it Mozart in the Jungle or Mozart? And not to be compared. But this is about the aesthetic and personal trials of a composer. The first one was called The Constant Nymph, and that has not been seen because it got into a copyright difficulty with the author of the original book. And we're showing it, actually, and that movie, in my view, is a key to Erich Wolfgang Korngold's idea of what music is, what music should be. And then there's a more famous film, Deception, with Betty Davis. So in Hollywood, when you think of this music is, you'll recognize the fingerprint, the very distinctive. Korngold is a very distinctive composer. He's not an imitator, although he grew up as a young child and was able to emulate, if you will, a very sophisticated musical language. He developed his own, and that you hear it in the movies and you hear it in this opera. And And then to close the story and open the floor to questions, Korngold, after a successful career in the movie business, his father died, but he didn't lose the ambition to become, to gain a place as a great composer in the sense of Brahms or Strauss. So he gives up movie writing and returns to serious composition, and in his mind, not that the movies are not serious, but he had that old prejudice that there was his father disapproved of the whole movie escapade. He writes a lot of music, and most famously a symphony. He goes back to Vienna in order to revive Die Katrin, which is the last opera he wrote, which had a very brief and unnoticed premiere in Stockholm before the war, in Sweden. And he discovers that the Austrians want nothing to do with him. First of all, most of the people he knows are dead. Most of his property has been expropriated. And the people who are alive were all largely collaborators. And he was a bad reminder. And then there was a young generation of modernists and young composers and musicians who thought this is just old-fashioned and way out of date. Why do they think that? And that's the problem I'll leave you with, that it doesn't involve this opera, but it does involve the late Korngold. So already when this opera was written, Korngold was the object of derision by modernists. And they said, after the First World War, we forget that the First World War was an extremely bloody and traumatic event and transformed the face of Europe, especially for Austrians, the dismemberment of the empire, and the revival of a rabid nationalism. It brought the Russian Revolution into being, and they would change the world technologically, politically. And how could one write in an old-fashioned way? Furthermore, didn't we as artists, they argued, have some complicit relationship in allowing industrialized, upper middle class, smug society to thoughtlessly engage in this carnage and killing and violence? Did we distract them by beauty? You know, funny operettas, beautiful songs, kind of a smug, decorative definition of beauty that divorced beauty from ethics. So the relation of beauty and evil, or beauty and good, or art and good, art and ethics, was at the center of the conversation in the 1920s. That's why Berg did what he did, that's why he chose Wozzeck, and Lulu by Wedekind. That's why Hindemith did Sancta Susanna, and Murder, Hope of Women, the Kokoschka play. These were the radical painters and expressionist dramatists. And they wanted to poke the eye in the smug bourgeois audience that supported Kaiser Wilhelm and supported the Austrians in the war. And were proud of their culture. They could recognize the Beethoven Symphony, but they sort of closed the window shades as people got murdered and killed for no purpose at all, or people were starving. And here was this unbelievable talent writing to them in a kind of escapist way. And he and his father defending old canons of beauty that derive from a world that had brought nothing but disaster and suffering. Now that issue in the 1920s became intense during the war. And with the revelation of the concentration camps after the war, a young generation said, we can't write like our parents and grandparents. They were fellow travelers in this horror. And the fascists supported the kind of aesthetic, as did Stalin, that Korngold wrote in. They They were declaring music to be degenerate, modern music, modernist music. And so there was a strange association between the sort of soundtracks, which are all, you know, affirmative and beautiful and thrilling and so forth and so on, in the midst of what? And Korngold had contempt for these composers. He believed the rules of beauty in music had nothing to do with politics, and that they were true. So he was not himself. He was an honest defender. But for a young generation, this guy coming back out of nowhere with this old-fashioned music seemed impossible. When the Violin Concerto with Heifetz was premiered in the United States after the war, it was hammered by all the critics as kind of a kitsch, decorative kitsch, bling, musical bling. And one has to understand it was not only just angry young generation, but there was a real issue. Adorno famously was reputed to say, how can one write lyric poetry after Auschwitz? Well, people did. Paul Celan did. You didn't have to do only what Beckett did. You didn't have to go in the modernist direction. Korngold thought these tools, as did Strauss, although Strauss was a collaborator, these tools were the real truth about how music works. So Korngold was abandoned by everybody. It was a traumatic experience. He returns to Hollywood. His last film is actually a depoliticized depiction of Wagner's life called Magic Fire. And Wagner sort of comes over as sort of a good guy, improbable thing to have done, but there it is. He actually appears as a conductor in it because the guy who was going to play the Hans Richter didn't show up, so they put a beard on him and put him in the pit, Korngold. And it was a fantastic musician, fantastic conductor, a fantastic facility. Anyway, he was very unhappy and returned to America and then died at age 60. This is a fantastic achievement, this opera. It is, first of all, it's long, but you have no better place to go. And so don't do what people did when I was a boy and stood at the Met, and I always sat. I always got a seat for the last act of Tristan. I always got a seat for last act of Parsifal. I always got a seat. I loved standing for the German repertoire. I never sat down in Bohème. Because people actually, Marriage of Figaro was there were enough people were dumb enough to leave, so I could sit down. But so stay to the end. This is an opera that rewards attention. The cast is terrific, absolutely terrific, and this is very hard. So for some reason, Strauss did it, and Korngold did it. I don't know what the post-Wagnerian idea of a tenor voice is, kind of Helden tenor based, and this is punishing. The tessitura is very high and relentless. The baritone is a huge role. The three sort of main, and the Faulkner also terrific, fantastic cast. And it's beautifully directed by Christian Reth, beautifully directed. Solves a lot of the problems of the opera that when we chose it, I was worried about how are you going to do this. I had the idea of putting it on Vulcan, to make it sort of in another planet. But it is sort of a science fiction mystery kind of aspect to it. But it's a wonderful opera, very provocative. There is a feminist critique to be made of it. It does traffic in the old Goethe, Mahler idealization of the eternal feminine and its redemptive power, completely constructed through the eyes of men. So it's a little awkward in that regard. It's not entirely self-critical about this. And so it has a twist to it which can't get rid of. It's written into the libretto. But the music is startling, and it deserves to be in the repertory, and it is, especially in times when we struggle with the issue of tyranny and the sort of decline in faith in liberal democracy, both in Europe and the United States, places like Hungary, Turkey, Russia, possibly even now England, Italy, the United States. The issue of freedom, oppression, tyranny is relevant. So the subtext of the opera, I don't share the romantic notion that love will redeem us. No love in is going to restore freedom and the absence of cruelty that we now are engaged in, if I may be permitted, as a nation on our southern border. But it's interesting that this is an opera that comes out of a politically contested time. It does redeem. One thing which I think is wonderful about it is that it makes you think that the 20th century, there were most composers held on to a long tradition of music writing that's tonal and comprehensible, where you as the audience, get it right away. And that's what made it into the movies, and that's a good thing. I don't share, I never did, the modernist snobbery to a long list of conservative composers who in the 50s and 60s were derided, American composers and European composers. And Korngold was a symbolic defender of that continuity in musical tradition, and deservedly so. So it's the one thing you can be assured of, as I look around the audience, is that you may be able to see another Tosca in your lifetime, probably another Bohème, maybe, I'm sure, another Ring. I can't believe how many, that for sure. And not all the Strauss operas, but savor, this is a unique opportunity to see this fantastic piece of work. Questions? How is this going to work? So let me come to you. Let me come to you. You can leave, by the way. Don't leave during the performance, but you can leave now. This is not quite as important. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. As long as I've been coming to see your operas every summer, it's always been European. And I came across some interesting trivia the other day. Of every opera performed at the Metropolitan Opera, the one that had the most curtain calls at its premiere, 60 curtain calls, I think it was 1928. It still stands as Marymount by Howard Hanson. So that leads me to ask you, have you ever thought of doing an American opera, and which would it be?
Oh yeah, and it's a good question there. The Met also did The Emperor Jones by Louis Grunberg. They also did an opera by Deems Taylor, who got famous, in the 50s, a kind of I don't know which one it was called. And then Bernard Herrmann, the movie composer, wrote an opera which we've looked at carefully. And actually, I'm due to do part of Act 3 in a concert of all places in Singapore. And that's on Wuthering Heights. It's an opera of the Bronte novel. And so we've done one American opera, two actually. We did The Tender Land by Copland, and we did Mark Blitzstein's Regina, which is a wonderful opera. Blitzstein is a fantastic opera. The question is awfully good, and we did the Regina when we did Copland, the Copland year. If this enterprise were not so expensive, which it is, and we so poor, the situation might be different. Getting an audience for an American opera by an unknown dead composer is trying to, I don't know, sell hay to a car owner, thinking that the car owner has horses. It's very difficult. And I would say in defense of this choice, Korngold is an American. He's an American. He was a proud possessor of an American passport, and this is part of his work. So I think I'll put Korngold in the American column. But it's a very good question, and more should be done. You're absolutely right. Some of them have political problems. Look at Porgy and Bess. So that arguably is the, fantastic, and it's very hard. It's complicated in today's politics to stage it and to do it. But your point is very well taken. I wish we could do more.
First of all, thank you for doing Heliane. I'm brimming with gratitude to you folks for this. That's the first. Now, at the end of most opera scores, the final stage direction is Die Vorhang schließt, the curtain falls. In this score, Korngold writes...
You're always somebody who knows much more than you do in the audience. Always. Yes, go ahead.
Die Vorhang schließt am Licht und Schönheit. The curtain closes on light and beauty. I'm just wondering if he was like talking about this the end of this beautiful music that we've just listened to, or is it prophetic in terms of this is maybe the end of the political social situation it's going, or the end of the type of what my belief in the art world should be versus the modernists, or along those lines?
It's an extremely good question. So our first performance was Friday night, and I think when we were taking the curtain calls, we expected the curtain to fall, which it didn't, and I think our lead finally walked off the stage, which took us all off the stage. I think you're onto something that Korngold and others, he's not the only one, have a problem with the curtain falling. This is a problem in all operas. It's one of the tragic things about the end of the Rosenkavalier, that the people begin to clap as the curtain falls and the music isn't done. This happens all the time, and it drives you to distraction, because one of the great geniuses, it's very hard to start a composition and very hard to end it. Everything in between is a little easier. But how you start and how you close is a very serious matter. And leaving the scene up, right, may actually be a way of signaling the absence of closure, that the residue is longer. You may be onto something. I had never actually thought of it. But I'm going to ask Christian backstage, the director. I definitely think that the love triumphing over tyranny is connected with the radical assertion of beauty in music. And that's why he liked the operetta, because that was, and also the friendliness of beauty, as opposed to the sort of upsetness that some radicals in the 20s did with their music. Sancta Susanna, for example, was banned. People hissed and booed. And the audience was drawn into this. In 1923, I think 1923, when I think The Rite of Spring was played in the Musikverein in Vienna, and the audience hissed, booed, 10 years after its, long, it become really world famous. So there was some kind of anger, and I think Korngold, both father and son, are making a plea for the, the way religious truth is true, because it's divinely ordained. What you're about to hear is, and the set, partly how the set, this is a hard opera to visualize, and I think they've done a fantastic job.
Can I follow up on the ending?
Yes.
This is a spoiler alert.
Wait, give him a microphone.
I think I can talk pretty loud.
They can't hear you. Go.
First of all, thank you again for this fabulous opera. And I did see it on Friday night. This is our second go-around. And spoiler alert, at the libretto says at the very end, the stranger and Heliane are together. And yet the staging, he goes off into the crowd and she does not. Could you clarify what's going on there?
I'll leave you to decide whether it's been honored. I don't know exactly. They are together. I don't know how they end up departing. I'm busy at the time, and so I'm not actually what I don't remember from the staging rehearsal, but it's something like that. We don't follow all the literal. Let me warn those of you who are real aficionados of this. When an opera is not successful, I'll be the last question, but I think it's a very good question. When an opera is not successful, right? You have to ask the question why, right? And so one of it can be simply politics and bad luck and all this kind of stuff. The other thing is that you have to make certain changes, either in the stage direction, and in my case, in some of the structural tempo relationships. Sometimes the tempos are just either they don't fit or they don't advance the call without cutting it. So, and he had 2 editions. We're doing the 2nd edition, and there's a lot of advice given to how this should go, which is bad advice. In one of the last arias of The Ruler, for example, he calls for an acceleration into the aria and doesn't work. Actually, to set the aria up, you actually frame it by doing the exact opposite. So there are interpretive decisions that you want to find the reason why the opera didn't succeed, and you want to make it succeed for a contemporary audience. And the pacing of the opera gets involved. So I think the director, so there's some things, for example, I once stood next to a real Wagner aficionado when I was a teenager who always objected that in the production of the Med of Walküre, Fricka doesn't come on a cart drawn by a ram with horns. Now, I actually didn't go to see the ram horn. I'm tolerant. It is upsetting when things get totally distorted, so what you read on the libretto and what you see don't cohere. That's very hard to reconcile. But I'm curious what you think at the end. Anyway, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.